So S3, we still believe it's the safest place for your data. And we've got 16 years and 200 plus trillion objects durably stored with 11 nines to help justify that claim. But when we talk about those claims that Hiran showed, then what else do we need to do to protect that data in S3? Why do we need to do things like replication or backup? And the real reason is because the storage has sort of changed since the introduction of S3 and the introduction of public cloud storage. In the past, you had to be concerned with physical access to the storage and the media itself and corruption of the media. Those things are less relevant in the public cloud storage world. But what is still relevant is the human side of things, human error, accidental deletions, malicious deletions, where we don't necessarily know what the intent is of a deletion request to the data. We have to authorize those and honor those if they're properly authorized. So in a lot of cases, what customers have to think about in the public cloud when they're storing their 250 trillion plus objects in S3 is the human side of things and the software side of things. This might be human error, this might be malicious intent, and maybe things like ransomware or natural disasters. So we're going to kind of cover some of these capabilities that are inherent to S3 and then also some that are optional that can be layered on top of S3. And when we talk about those layers, it kind of just looks like an everlasting gobstopper type of view here. Not all data is created equal in value to customers. We know that, we honor that, and that's why Hiran went through all of the different storage classes earlier, where the access patterns and the value of the data and the retrieval times may influence the decision of where to store that data in which specific storage class is the best fit for the value of that data to your organization. Same holds true with data protection. So when we look at the data in the center stored kind of in the middle of the gobstopper there, you've got those IAM policies that are going to restrict logical access to the data, right? That's going to be your access controls. And that's always where we start this conversation. Beyond that, though, we're going to take you through some of the different levels and different layers of data protection that you can add on top of the S3 native resiliency, durability, and availability that Hiran talked about that's built into our storage classes already. So things like object versioning, object lock, replication. I'll dive a little bit on a specific part of S3 storage lens that Lee touched on, and then we'll talk about a little bit of our partner solutions as well here. So when we jump into the conversation around data protection with S3, it really starts with object versioning, and that can be enabled at the bucket itself. And what this really changes then is it changes the overwrite and deletion behavior to be obviously much more of a logical deletion rather than a physical deletion. So as you add objects into S3, and those objects need to either be overwritten or deleted, versioning is there as that first line of defense. It's your foundation so that we are always essentially appending. Deletions become logical, overwrites become logical, and we keep appending essentially new versions onto that version stack. And then like Hiran and Lee talked about, you have storage lens and lifecycle policies there to help control the lifecycle and the rate of growth of if you need to limit the number of versions that you retain for a period of time. But it all starts with versioning. And so that's really the conversation that we have most frequently with customers is
so Peter,
what you want to set up and start with. Question?
Yeah. So if I'm buying, and then it's like 25 cents per gigabyte month or something. I'm not sure exactly what the price is. It's on the order of cents per month. So it's like 2 cents per month. If I'm doing versioning, I'm paying for all the versions, not just the latest one, right? From a capacity perspective.
That's right. Everything you store, you pay for. So it's always pay as you go. So versioning itself costs you nothing. It only costs you something when you start adding additional versions.
I got you.
Hey, Peter, I'd just like to point out also that, like Peter mentioned, you want to set expiration policies. You also have a setting where you can limit the number of versions that you keep before it auto deletes prior versions. So
that's right. And so these object versions, they're always appended, right? We're not overwriting and we're not adding to, we're not appending to the object itself. We're incrementing the version count of that object as newer versions are added And when a deletion is made, the deletion becomes a logical deletion. So the deletion marker itself becomes the current version. All your previous versions are there. And in the S3 console, one of the things that sometimes can be missed is there's a toggle switch to say, show me my current versions only, or show me all of my versions. And so that's an important toggle to understand when you're looking at it from the S3 console, so that are you seeing all of your versions or just the latest version? And if it's a deletion marker as the latest version, that was one of the metrics that Lee showed in Storage Lens to understand what does the deletion marker count look like? How many objects do we have where the current version is the deletion marker?
Now,
Any questions on object versioning?
one more question.
Please.
Versioning. For things like snapshots and stuff like that in the past, there was a lot of, I'll call it space efficiency characteristics built into these sorts of things. Does your versioning support? I mean, if I'm versioning let's say a 1 terabyte object, and I have 2 versions of it, am I storing 2 terabytes of data, or am I just storing the changes between version 1 and version 2?
No, you're storing 2 terabytes. So 2 objects, each a terabyte in size. So your storage cost would be 2 terabytes for both of those objects. Each object is independent and unrelated to each other, so there's no chain or anything like that. So each object is independent from each other. So if you delete and then permanently delete one of those 2 terabyte versions, the other one will still be there. So each version is independent from any of the other versions in that version stack.
Okay, thanks.
Great question. Okay, so let's talk about deletes a little bit further here. So S3 object lock really has become, I think, the de facto standard for immutable cloud storage. Our partners use it. So if you are using a backup application that's storing backups in S3, and those are immutably stored, that's typically done with S3 object lock. Our competitors use S3 object lock. They mostly still use the name. Sometimes they'll change the name slightly, but it's the S3 object lock API under the covers that's really making those objects immutable. And so there's really 2 modes for object lock. There's a governance mode that allows you to have a lock for a period of time that can be either extended or shortened, with a specific privilege to allow you to shorten it. And then there's a more stringent compliance mode, which says that this object cannot be permanently deleted. It can be logically deleted with a deletion marker, but that object is physically retained in S3 and cannot be deleted, even by our CEO or Hiren or Lee or myself. That object is retained in S3 until that lock is expired. That lock can be extended, but it cannot be shortened in compliance mode. So compliance mode can be set on a per object level, per version level, or you can set it as a default for the bucket itself for any new objects that you want to write into that bucket. And if you have a lot of data in S3 that you want to lock down with object lock, we have a pretty unique feature called batch operations that allows you to do bulk object management so that you can manipulate object lock or copy or tags on billions of objects. And so object lock can be set up through the default for new objects on a bucket, or it can be set as a bulk operation through batch operations to apply locks to billions of objects.
Are you
And
gonna,
again, there's 2 modes.
sorry.
Question?
Yeah, I got a question.
Yeah.
Are you gonna talk about retrieval and restoring the data as well? What that looks like?
Right. Great question. So retrieval is almost instantaneous because we're not actually moving data anywhere. When you create a new version with object versioning enabled, those versions are all kept local to the same bucket that the original object stored in that you created additional versions of. So when you want to bring that back, you can always retrieve any object version. By default, we always go after the current version of the object. But if you wanted to say, I'd like version number 7 or 12 or 212 or 212,000, it doesn't really matter. Each object version has its own unique ID. And you just specify that version ID on your retrieval request, and then you can get that specific object version
So
at any time.
how granular is that? So, I mean, you're showing stuff for compliance. So if I need to just go back for maybe 3 or 4 emails for a court case, or not emails, it's not the greatest example in this case, but I need to go back for 3 or 4 files for a court case. Can I get that granular as far as retrieving and then where do they get restored? Do I have to put them someplace or do they go back to where they were again?
Great question. You can do both. So if you want to put that older version as the current version, you can absolutely do that. Or if you want to just download it to your laptop, that would be a standard S3 get object request, in which case you would just tell us what specific object version you want to get, and we'll go retrieve that and let you download that right to your laptop or any browser, anything that talks HTTPS.
And
to
you
S3.
can go granular down to a file level versus an entire object, or is the file the object?
The file is the object, but thanks for reminding me, you can actually do an S3 select or arranged get to get inside of a specific file. Maybe you wanted just a range of data in a table. So you can go sub-object if you want to, using things like S3 select or what's called a ranged get, where you just want a range of data, a byte range. So we support both of those as well. Great question.
And so what's the cost? Is the cost going to be different if you go sub-object, or is it going to be the same cost for retrieving that out?
It's typically the same request. S3 select is a little different there. Because it has some additional sophistication built into it. So S3 select does have a slightly different cost, but generally it's always a get cost to get the object out of S3. And the get itself is we meter those per 1,000 gets. So every 1,000 gets is, I think, I'm not sure that, I don't remember the exact price, but it's pretty low. So it's per 1,000 get requests. So beyond 11 nines of durability and availability, that really involves something to think about where you need to go beyond just a specific region. So like Karen talked about, the reliability, the durability, the availability of S3, again, we think it's the safest place to store your data, but the world is a complicated place, getting more complicated. So this is a map of undersea cables, and we like this slide here to talk about this just a little bit here, because we don't necessarily own all of that infrastructure, right? There is connectivity going all around the world. And so these cables that connect all of us onto the World Wide Web, those cables are physical objects and those can be damaged. And if there is a cable cut, that could cause a regional disruption. So in the case of a single region, customers have a need to store their data in multiple AWS regions for a variety of use cases. Some of them may be resiliency. Some of them may be compliance, where they're legally required to from a state, local, governmental, or maybe it's a broader regulatory body that requires multiple copies to be kept in multiple geographic locations separated by thousands of miles. And it may be for performance, where we have compute resources in a different region and we want to bring the data closer to those compute resources to run analytics jobs, queries on them, genomics processing. And so that's really where S3 replication comes in. And this is an amazing replication engine. I've been doing storage for a very long time, and I'm thoroughly always impressed with the amount of data that is processed through S3 replication on a daily basis. Our replication is a little different than others. You can replicate the entire bucket. You can replicate just a folder or a prefix, or you can replicate based upon a tag selection. You can replicate all of your existing data, or you can replicate new objects. And most objects complete replication in seconds to minutes. And then we even have a replication time control feature that puts a 15-minute SLA for all your new objects within 15 minutes or less. 99.99% of all your objects completing replication in 15 minutes or less with that SLA. So I'm thoroughly impressed with the S3 replication engine. It's an amazing piece of technology. And so it's something I love talking about. So if you have a need to move that around in different regions, you can replicate those buckets to multiple AWS regions. And then on top of that, we allow you to create what we call a floating global endpoint that represents sort of like a group of all of those buckets and those different geographic locations. Maybe you have one in US East in Virginia, maybe you have one in Dublin, maybe you have one down in Sydney. And so what you can do with S3 in the replication of your data in those different geographic locations is set up a global endpoint that spans essentially all 3 copies. And it allows you then to have a single global endpoint called a multi-region access point that allows you to route your traffic through a single endpoint, and then we will decide which region is the closest region to perform that request, to service that request, whether it's a get or a put. We will figure out what's the closest region. Replication is still going on behind the scenes to synchronize the data, but this multi-region access point can take traffic in from an on-premise data center. It'll take traffic in from a VPC in region A, an application there, transmit that data across AWS's network without a VPC peering connection required to a bucket in a different region. Or if you are having traffic come in from the public internet, that traffic can be onboarded through a local edge location, and we will onboard that to the AWS network and accelerate it across our network to the region with the lowest, or essentially the closest region. And you can see up to a 60% performance increase for uploads or downloads because we've taken that traffic off of the public internet and brought it onto the AWS network.
So Peter, the replication is done at object close, or is it done while the object is being written? I mean, so this, how is the replication actually accomplished, and when is it accomplished on a per object basis?
Sure, we replicate objects. Lee talked about that 200 response. So as S3 says, yes, this object has been committed and landed in a bucket in S3, the replication engine says, new object. It's always constantly looking for new objects. As that 200 response is received, that object is now officially in S3. We will then kick off that replication process. It's asynchronous replication to that either different region, different bucket, different prefix, different storage class. You really have a lot of flexibility there on your replication choices. It can be the same region, different region, but we pick it up as soon as that object is committed to S3. So that replication, once that has replicated those objects across those 3 different regions here, you can see from a single multi-region access point, whether the customer client is in the US, Europe, Asia, we will then look to see what is the closest region to route that request through this global endpoint. You don't have to replicate all your data, you can replicate some of it. This multi-region access point supports up to 17 different AWS regions simultaneously. So you can have 1 bucket per region, up to 17 different regions, all behind 1 global endpoint. Bringing it all together with S3 Storage Lens, this is just a piece of what Lee showed, but I wanted to kind of double click on this from a data protection perspective. So Lee showed the tabs there in Storage Lens. We're kind of just double clicking on data protection here in particular. So this is really where, if you appreciated the features I just talked about, this is the place to go inside of S3 to get a bird's eye view across your organization, across multiple accounts, multiple buckets. How much data am I replicating? How much data is object locked? How much data is encrypted? How much data is versioned? And so this is really, again, I'm with Lee. This is my favorite feature to talk about with S3 is Storage Lens, because it brings all of that together and you can get a really good idea of the risk to your data without any of those additional protection layers applied. And it may not be appropriate for all of your data, but most customers have data that they do want to version, object lock, and replicate. And Storage Lens is a great place to kind of bring all of that together. And Lee talked about the free version. It's got 14 days of historical data, so you can get it up and running by lunchtime today. And that's it. Our key takeaways, we still feel S3 is the safest place to store your data. Intelligent tiering for those unknown and changing access patterns to get that automatic cost optimization. Object lock to make sure that data is immutable and undeletable. And then Storage Lens to kind of bring it all together for your data protection dashboard. And we've also started to see our partners pick up the ability to back up S3 as a source. In my time at AWS, the last several years. That's the biggest change I've seen, is that S3 is now, and object storage has really become the primary storage for a lot of applications. It's now no longer just a place to kind of park data. S3 is the place where customers are creating new primary data, and they want to protect that in the same way as they've done traditionally with our on-premise primary storage. And so they're looking for backup applications to do that. AWS Backup now supports that. We have partners such as Clumio and Commvault that now protect S3 as well as a primary data source, not just as a destination for the backups.